Let's talk about the philosophers a little bit more. Give us the parable of Anthony Flew and John Wisdom, that the philosophers, it's really a good illustration about the liberals who are talking about God, and they got nothing to talk about. I mean, it exposes them, but it's terrific for historic Christianity. Would you explain that parable and why that's so?
The analytical philosophers, John Wisdom and Anthony Flew, developed a parable which they employ to show how nonsensical it is to talk about God. I think it's wonderful that one of these men is named John Wisdom. Makes you feel that the universe is not entirely in difficulty. That there is, yes. In this parable, we have two explorers coming across a clearing in the jungle. Right? The clearing in the jungle represents some degree of order in this world. All right? And the explorer says, there's a gardener who comes and takes care of this garden. The other says, there is no gardener. One of them represents a believer in God, the other represents an atheist. So, they sit down and they watch. No gardener is seen. They remember H.G. Wells' Invisible Man. So they put a barbed wire around the clearing and they electrify it to catch any invisible climber. But there is never any indication of anyone being there. They patrol it with bloodhounds, but the bloodhounds never give a cry. Finally, at the end, the believer says, but there is a gardener, invisible, intangible, insensible to electric shocks, and he comes and takes care of the garden which he loves. And the skeptic replies, but how does that kind of a gardener differ from an imaginary gardener or from no gardener at all? This parable is to show, presumably, that people who believe in God believe in something that suffers the death by 1,000 qualifications. God is not this, not that, not the other thing. There's never any evidence, and therefore believers in God might as well be believing in an imaginary God. Well, as you pointed out, John, that's exactly the mess that religious liberals get in.
Give them a few examples, like of Tillich's, et cetera, down the line.
Oh, yes. Well, Karl Barth, whom you mentioned previously, Karl Barth said the resurrection occurred, but it didn't occur in ordinary history, so it can't be investigated. Paul Tillich says that God is the ground of all being and also being itself. And so you're not sure whether you're looking at God when you shave in the morning and look in the mirror. You don't know what the ground of all being is. It can't be hamburger, but there's some sort of ground there. The whole thing is so indefinable and so vague, so untestable, that you actually don't end up with any sort of definable belief at all. The Eastern religions, in talking about Brahman is all, get into that same sort of difficulty. But historic Christianity, and this is the important point, historic Christianity is not in those categories, not in the slightest. Why? Because in historic Christianity, you don't need to set up a barbed wire fence. You don't need any bloodhounds. The gardener literally enters the garden. I think it's fascinating on Easter morning, the women thought they were seeing a gardener. That's the gardener of the Flew Wisdom parable, everybody. The gardener came into this world and he displayed himself by many infallible proofs.